Hiya, it's Jimmy, and today I'm talking about Pet by Akwaeke Emezi. So, you might remember me talking about Freshwater by Akwaeke Emezi, which is a novel aimed at adults. Pet is their debut YA novel, so I would say it's probably appropriate for aged about 12 and up. It's quite accessible, but also if you're older than that, if you're an adult, then you can get a lot out of it as well. So the blurb says, "There are no monsters anymore, or so the children in the city of Lucille have been taught. Jam and her best friend Redemption have grown up with this lesson all their lives. But when Jam meets Pet, she begins to question what she's been told. Pet has come to hunt the evil lurking in Redemption's house." So, as that blurb kind of suggests, it's set in a sort of utopian city called Lucille. And that's one thing that I really liked about it from the get-go and drew me in. I'm quite interested in utopias, ideas of utopia, and utopia in fiction, partly because I'm interested in the history of socialist utopias in fiction, especially things like William Morris's News from Nowhere. And I attended a reading group which was talking about utopia and dystopia and ideas like that a few months ago. So those sorts of thoughts have been going around my head. I also was a fan of Freshwater, so I was keen to dive into this and I blasted through it. I read it in a couple of days. It does draw you in quite quickly. The writing style is accessible and engaging, and it's easy to read, and you want to know what's going to happen. And the chapters are quite short, so at the end of every chapter you think, okay, one more chapter. The type of utopia portrayed, it focuses much more on the social aspects rather than the economic aspects, like you get in something like News from Nowhere. The book has strong representation as well of different sorts of people and different sorts of families. And for example, the main character, Jam, is a trans girl, and part of how the utopic nature of the city is portrayed is by talking about how much easier it is to live as a trans girl in Lucille, and she's kind of aware of how much more difficult it would have been in the olden days before it became before the revolution, as it's described as like a slow revolution which involved getting rid of what they call monsters. And monsters, I think, are, at first it's not entirely clear. It sort of becomes clear that monsters are people who do monstrous things. The belief in Lucille is that all the monsters have been vanquished. There are no free monsters left. All the monsters have been contained. There are systems of education and so on in place to stop the development of new monsters, and people live relatively happily in this society free from monsters. And it's a bit of a mantra that there's no monsters left in Lucille. But something that happens in a lot of utopia fiction is something comes along to disturb the utopia in some way, and often that is something external. So in News from Nowhere, the main character is kind of a time traveller who travels from the time that it was written in the 1890s to the time that it's set in about 2100. And that outsider coming in creates the opportunity for a lot of discussion and examination of the society and how it became the utopia that it is, and what kind of utopia it is, and what that means and everything. Likewise, in Herland by, I think, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, that is set in a utopic society made up entirely of women, and then 3 men arrive. And so there's that kind of disruption that leads to the examination of the utopia and what kind of utopia it is and everything. So that happens in Pet as well, but instead of an external disruption, it's an internal one, where actually an external character does kind of arrive on the scene, but that exposes that there's an internal disruption in the utopia, and that there is somebody, or there is a monster. They come and say that they're hunting a monster, and that obviously implies that there is a monster left in Lucille, going against this mantra that there's no monsters left. So I like how that makes us challenge the idea of the utopia and challenges the utopic nature of it without being dystopian, it's not dystopian, and without being anti-utopian either. A few months ago I heard an interview with Sophie Lewis on a podcast, who's the author of the book Full Surrogacy Now, and she was talking about how in, say, the 80s, a lot of dystopian fiction was not just dystopian but anti-utopian. So it was reacting kind of to a lot of the utopian ideas of kind of the hippies in the 60s and that sort of thing. So, and an example that she gives, Sophie Lewis, in that interview is The Handmaid's Tale. And if you look at ideas from the 60s challenging gender roles and family roles and norms around sex and relationships and things like that, you can kind of see what she's getting at in that. But anyway, so I'm interested in that idea of challenging utopias, and I like that this does it in a way, as I say, that's not anti-utopian, it's not dystopian, it's within the utopia that the challenge comes from. And one of the lessons that you kind of get from that is that utopia isn't just a place or a particular society, it's a process. It takes constant work. There's flaws, and you need to be able to point them out. You need criticism to maintain the utopia, and people need to be open to hearing that criticism so that you can address problems, and you can kind of apply that message to anything, and the book does as well, to different levels. So you can look at it in terms of society as a whole, or a country or a city. So you might think about certain societies that have gone through revolutions and then have reached a point where the state is very closed to any criticism and shuts it down, and that ends up being a source of oppression and gets in the way of addressing other oppression that arises in the society. You can also look at it at the level of a family, where you might have a very happy family with a lot of nice people in it that looks very happy, and you can't imagine that someone in the family would do something dreadful. So especially adults can then be closed off, and that's a pattern that a lot of people who have experienced or know someone who's experienced abuse from an adult, as a child, from an adult who should have been sort of a safe member of the family or safe member of their community, and that disbelief when you try and bring it up with the other adults, and how shutting that down prevents the original harm from being addressed and becomes a form of harm in itself. So the book is a good lens for that kind of thing at a social level, at a family level. One thing that I like about it, one sort of small theme, is the library as a source of power and refuge. And so some of the characters, when they are disbelieved by adults, they go to the library, and the librarian is a really helpful and supportive figure in the story, and sort of the books and the knowledge give a little bit of a roadmap to someone who is being disbelieved, and says there are things you can do. You can arm yourself with knowledge, and that can help. You know, if people are not believing you and they're putting doubts in your head, don't let that close your mind off. Reading what other people have written can give you access to that knowledge that what's going on really is wrong and something does need to be done about it. And the book itself can do that to an extent, especially for younger readers who might recognise some of those themes at the family level or anything like that. So I think it's a good book that will be helpful for younger readers. I think it's enjoyable, and there's a lot to think about however old you are, and you can think about it in terms of a very personal level or a political level, in terms of making changes in your daily life to try and be a better person and better support to the people around you, especially vulnerable people like children, or if you're interested in changing society to make it better, it's useful in terms of thinking about that and how you go about that and things to keep in mind to keep that safe for everybody as well. Just as literature, I think it's a good read, entertaining. It's definitely more accessible than Freshwater, so whatever your age, if you're interested in reading some Emezi, whether you enjoyed Freshwater or you were put off, then I would recommend giving Pet a go. Emezi also has a book coming out in August called The Death of Vivek Oji, so keep an eye out for that. And I do think they are one of the really interesting authors at the moment who keeps producing interesting and quite different things, so they're definitely worth keeping an eye on. So that's it for now. Thanks for watching.